Hello everyone, my name is Melissa. If you're here, it's because you, like the rest of us, like some horror history and true crime once in a while, you know, just to deepen that depression a little. If this is something that sounds interesting to you, please hit that subscribe button and that little bell icon so you can be reminded every time I post a new video. Get some soap. Let me introduce you to the new little baby. So beautiful. But anyway, please like this video to, you know, help out with some algorithm. Also, buy some soap because you know you stink. Let's get this story going. Okay, so today's story is very fucked up. So I do want to give a fair warning. There is a lot of very unsettling details. Fair warning. It's kind of known. I guess it became a pretty big story, and I think they're making a Hulu show on this case actually. This story starts on June 6th, 1940 in the Salt Lake LDS Temple. Stands for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this is the day that Watson Leroy Lafferty and Claudine Jones got married. Together they had 8 children, 2 girls and 6 boys. With their oldest, his name is Ron Lafferty, and Alan Lafferty was the youngest son. Dan Lafferty was 6 years younger than Ron. Watson Lafferty was a chiropractor. He had a thriving practice that he ran out of his home. They were raised, I believe, in Orem, Utah, and their family, they were brought up in a very religious family, and their dad was a very, not only religious, but he believed in discipline within his kids, you know, and sometimes I guess he did punish them a bit too harshly. So yes, Watson, their father, he was very strict, and he would sometimes take his like religious beliefs a bit too far when it came to like disciplining his children. There is a story that I read that once when all the kids were young, one of the sons accidentally shot himself in the stomach with an arrow, and the father told him that he would have to suffer until morning for breaking the Sabbath. But aside from all of, you know, the crazy religious stuff, they were said to be a very close-knit family. Like, they actually, you know, loved each other very much and cared for each other. But in the LDS faith, the boys, they are encouraged, but they're not required to partake in some missions when they turn 19. And most kids do, and this is all like self-funded. So while they were growing up, Ron and Dan were like best friends, and they were always with each other. They always had each other's backs. Even if they were like getting into fights and stuff, they were there for each other, which is pretty nice. So when Ron grew up, he was actually a very active member of the church, the LDS church himself. In 1960, Ron was called to serve a mission in Florida. After 2 years of his service, he came home and married a woman named Diana. And then soon they had their first daughter, and her name was Carol Lee. 6 years later, Dan was called to serve his mission to Scotland, and he was the first out of all of his family to like leave the United States. And while he was in Scotland, he met his wife, his future wife, and her name is Matilda. She had 2 daughters from a previous relationship, and after spending 2 years in his mission, Dan and Matilda married, and in 1977 they had their first daughter. Her name was Rebecca. Ron was said to be a really good father to all 3 of the girls. He was just like a very normal man of God, I guess, but there was nothing crazy about him. Or Dan. Dan was also very close to Ron's daughters, and they loved him very, very much. And soon Dan started going to school to become a chiropractor just like his father. It was around this time that his like behavior and his beliefs of religion and the law started to kind of like get skewed. It was said that you know, all of this started after an event that happened to him while he was in college. While he was attending school, Dan and Matilda, they ran like a little sandwich shop out of their house. Matilda, along with like the girls, they made the sandwiches, and then Dan would sell them out on the campus to students. And they actually made like a good amount of money doing this. They were able to pay for their necessities while Dan attended college. But it really didn't take long before the health department and the IRS found out about their little like business, you know, America. They shut them down, and so they started demanding that Dan pay taxes and the proceeds for the sandwiches. And this kind of like started his anti-government stance and views. Dan soon went as far as like revoking his own driver's license. He stopped paying taxes altogether, and he would even like try to not pay taxes, sales taxes at like stores. But it didn't always work out. At least he tried, you know. Soon after this, his like religious views began to kind of like mutate, because he believed that the Mormon church kind of like strayed away from their original teachings of the Book of Mormon and the practice of polygamy. And he wanted to make it his mission to revert or return his Mormon beliefs into existence, I guess. So what he started doing was that he started holding weekly meetings in his home, and he would preach his disdain for the control that he believed the government had over people. And at the same time, he was speaking out against the Mormon church for their like modern day teachings. And these weekly meetings were men only, which consisted mostly of the Lafferty brothers. It was almost like a church of their own, but like men only. They would call this little group the School of Prophets, and one of the people that regularly attended their meetings was Alan, their younger brother. He seemed to agree with like most of the things Dan was saying, with his like philosophies and ideas. He began trying to implement these ideas into his own family, and during this time Ron began attending these meetings as well, and he became like a very strong believer as well. One of the ideologies that they discussed was that women were to stay home with the children, and they should be open to the practice of polygamy. And Brenda, Alan's wife, was really not up for this. Brenda was a beautiful, blonde, very strong-willed, smart, and she just obviously did not want this to be her life. She was very educated. Brenda and Alan met while Brenda attended Brigham Young University, and Alan he attended the Utah Technical College. She was a journalism student, and she was the broadcast anchor for the college news channel. She was born on July 19th, 1960 to her parents Larray and James Wright. She grew up in Kimberly, Idaho, with 5 sisters and 1 brother, and they were also an LDS family, but they were like obviously like the more modern take on it, I guess. And they were very happy. They were a very happy family. So Brenda was described as a very driven, fun, energetic, bubbly person. She was actually also crowned second runner-up to Miss Idaho for a beauty scholarship, as a beauty scholarship contender. Brenda and Alan, they were married in the LDS Temple in 1982, and on April 28, 1983, they welcomed Erica Lane Lafferty, their first daughter, into the family. So they both decided that it would be best if Brenda stayed home full-time as a stay-at-home parent to care for Erica. Erica was learning to speak very quickly. She was a very smart baby, and she was gonna start walking soon. So now back to this School of Prophets Ron became kind of like the leader of this cult, because let's face it, that's exactly what it was a cult. And he would claim to receive these prophecies or revelations from God, and in one of his revelations, supposedly he said that God told him that his wife Diana, in her past life, she was the wife of a devil. Another revelation that Ron would get. And this kind of like, you know, even the other members of this School of Prophets cult, it kind of like freaked them out a bit, because this supposed revelation that Ron got from God, he called it the revelation of removal. Supposedly God told him that he needed to kill 4 people that were getting in the way of their mission, I guess. And it reads as follows: Thus saith the Lord unto my servants the prophets, it is my will and commandment that ye remove the following individuals, in order that my work might go forward. For they have truly become obstacles in my path, and I will not allow my work to be stopped. First, thy brother's wife Brenda, and her baby, Chloe Lowe, and then Richard Stowe. And it is my will that they be removed in rapid succession, and that an example be made of them, in order that others might see the fate of those who fight against the true saints of God. And it is my will that this matter be taken care of as soon as possible, and I will prepare a way for my instrument to be delivered, and instruction be given unto my servant. And it is my will that they show great care in his duties, for I have raised him up and prepared him for this important work, and he is not like unto my servant Porter Rockwell, and great blessings await him. For I am the Lord thy God, and have control over all things. Be still and know that I am with thee, even so. Amen. This is what God supposedly told. So, Chloe Lowe and Robert Stowe, they were neighbors and friends of Ron and Diana as well. And Ron saw them as traitors because they supported Diana's worries when she was like questioning Ron's kind of extreme religious beliefs, I guess, the way they were changing. And they were backing her up. And Robert Stowe also presided over Ron's excommunication from the Mormon Church. Peter Rockwell, who was, you know, mentioned by name in his revelation, he was a bodyguard to the Mormon Church founder and prophet Joseph Smith, and he was also a good friend of his from childhood. So this revelation was rejected by basically all of the members of this cult. I'm just gonna call it a cult from now on, because that's exactly what it is. Except 2 who were brothers, Watson and Dan Lafferty. They say that Alan had some involvement in this. He had some involvement in the cult from time to time. He would attend the meetings weekly, but I think only sometimes he was like actually involved in their extracurricular activities. So it's not really clear whether he was present or not when Ron was like revealing his revelation. But Alan did admit to kind of knowing that Ron had said these things. But I think he said that he didn't think that he was serious or that he would actually carry through with it. But Dan like truly believed that Ron had this revelation from God. And he felt that it was God's will, and he would not let anything get in the way of this revelation being fulfilled. So Ron and Dan actually like separated themselves from the School of Prophecy cult that they started, because the other members were not really supporting them. Like they were not in their support anymore because of the revelation of removal. Before they left, Ron actually made death threats to the members of this cult, which left them pretty like scared. And so of course both Diana and Matilda, they were not okay with how Ron and Dan were kind of like just getting way out of hand with this whole prophecy bullshit. So they would kind of confide in Brenda and ask her like, what should we do, because it's just kind of getting a bit too much. For Matilda, the final straw I think was when Dan, fucking sicko, he announced that he wanted to take Diana's daughter, his stepdaughter, who was 14 at the time, as his second wife. And trigger warning, Matilda's daughter, she actually reported that Dan had sexually abused her on several occasions. And because of this, Dan was excommunicated from the Mormon Church altogether. So he eventually let go of this idea of marrying his stepdaughter, and he instead married a Romanian immigrant Her name is Anne Randick, and she took care of Robert Redford's horses in a ranch that he owned in Spanish Fork, Utah. So, I mean, I think Dan saw it as he was technically practicing polygamy, even though his and Matilda's marriage was like basically done. But it's not really clear what happened between the marriage of Dan and Anne. Dan and Anne. So yes, like I said, Matilda and Diana, they frequently confided in Brenda and kind of seeking advice into how they should handle all these changes, you know, from their husbands. But because of Brenda's background, you know, she was a very strong person. She was not afraid to kind of stand up to her husband, and she advised Diana and Matilda that they didn't have to take any of this. And this kind of sparked Ron's hatred towards Brenda. But you know, if it's in the name of God, it's okay. Ron would also blame Brenda for keeping Alan from being as involved as he supposedly wanted in this cult, and from keeping him fully engaged in these ideologies that Ron and Dan had kind of adopted. So Diana eventually ended up divorcing Ron, and she moved to Florida with their 6 kids. Dan would end up moving out of the home that he shared with Matilda and the 3 girls, and they were also divorced. Ron and Dan would then go on an extended road trip, living in Ron's green Impala wagon. They were living in it. They were living in a car. So on July 24th, 1984, it was Ron, Dan, and 2 other men by the names of Ricky Knapp and Chip Carnitas. They had picked up these 2 men hitchhiking on the side of the road. They loaded up with knives. Ron had a sawed-off shotgun and ammo, and then they headed to Ellen and Brenda's house. They arrived at around 1:30 when they pulled up in the driveway. Brenda's car was there, but Ron went to the door alone, and he had the shotgun, the sawed-off shotgun, like inside his right sleeve, and he knocked several times, but Brenda didn't answer the door. Supposedly Dan was like kind of relieved that she didn't answer the door, because he thought that it was just kind of like a like a test from God to see if they would actually, you know, carry on with the supposed revelation, and thought that kind of just like testing their reliance, I guess. And you know, he thought that maybe her not answering the door was a sign that maybe they didn't really have to actually go through with it. She didn't answer. Ron just like went back to the car, and they drove about a block and a half away, and Dan just got this like, he said he was overcome by this like weird feeling that maybe he was the one that was supposed to do this, not Ron. And so they turned around and went back to Ellen and Brenda's house, or duplex, and Alan was the one that came out this time, and he went up to the door and knocked, and this time Brenda did answer the door. He asked her where Alan was, and she told him that he was at work, and Alan says that he was kind of silently in his mind speaking with God, kind of like asking him what to do next. I think Brenda had like the feeling that something bad was gonna happen, and she said, quote, "I knew that you were going to do something that nobody could stop." So Dan pinned Brenda down to the floor, and this is where it's gonna start getting kind of like gruesome. Warning from here on. So Dan pinned Brenda down to the floor, and she was begging for her life, like telling him that she would do anything that they wanted to just not hurt her baby. Ron then began punching Brenda, trying to subdue her, trying to get her to just like stop resisting, I guess, calling her like a bitch and a liar and all these names, and she was able to like get free, and she tried running away. But I think just like the terror of being attacked, you know, the adrenaline mixed with the blows that she had gotten to her head and face made her pass out while she was trying to run away. Dan then asked Ron to cut the cord from the vacuum And he did, and gave it to Dan, and Dan wrapped it around her neck twice. And he tied a knot, and with the knife that Ron had given Dan then slit Brenda's throat. So this entire time that this was going on, the two guys that they had picked up, Knapp and Carnes, they were waiting outside in the car, and they could hear, you know, the struggle that was happening. And they were kind of like debating whether they should just like leave, because they would be, you know, connected to this crime now. But they ultimately decided to just stay. Why, I don't know, but they just waited there in the car. So Dan had never been to Ellen and Brenda's house before. So as he was walking down the hallway, he was kind of like unsure of where he was going, but he said that God guided him straight to baby Erica's room. And okay, I'm not gonna cry, but when baby Erica saw Dan, he believes that he thought that she thought that he was her dad, because they did look a lot alike. They both had the beard and the hair. So she kind of reached up to him, and he picked her up, and also their voices sounded very similar. So Dan picked up baby Erica. He said, he talked to her and said, quote, "I'm not sure what this is all about, but apparently it's God's will that you leave this world. Perhaps we can talk about it later." And he then, oh God, I can't even say it. He then held baby Erica's head, and he proceeded to cut her throat. And it's reported that he did it with such force that he nearly decapitated her. She was 15 months old. I cried when I read this first. I cried because I had my 10-month-old nursing. I just cannot imagine like the type of sickness somebody needs to have in their mind to do something like this. But afterwards, Ron and Dan, covered in blood, they got back into their car and they drove away. They were their intention was to finish God's will and to go kill the other two people, which was Chloe and Richard. So they went to Chloe Lowe's house with the intention of killing her as well. Luckily, she was not home. And then they thought, like, to each other that they had done enough for one day. So they decided against going to Robert's house to murder him, but they did steal a bunch of stuff from Chloe's house. So Alan arrived home at around 8 p.m. He had actually been on the phone with her probably an hour before Dan and Ron got there. He noticed that the door was locked, and in this little town, nobody locked their doors, and he said it was very unusual for Brenda to lock the door when she was home. So he walked in and saw blood everywhere, saw Brenda laying on the floor with the cord wrapped around her neck and her throat cut. And he ran over to baby Erica's room and just found her propped up against the corner of her crib, deceased. And he ran over to his neighbor's house, and they called the police, and they obviously came right away, and they took Alan in for interrogation, because the spouse is usually the first suspect. And they were questioning him. He appeared to be like visibly shaken, which you would expect for somebody who just found their family, And he was able to tell them that he did hear, when they asked him, "Who do you think might have done this?" He said that he had heard Ron and Dan talking about it before, but he didn't think that they were actually going to go through with it. So then the manhunt started for Ron and Dan and their wagon that they were driving. The neighbors did reported seeing the green wagon parked outside Ellen and Brenda's house during this time, and they were able to locate the wagon in Cheyenne, Wyoming. When the police entered the home where the wagon was parked with their guns drawn, they only found the two men that were hitchhiking that Ron and Dan picked up. They had stolen the car and went there their separate way from Ron and Dan. But the police were able to find the knife that they used to murder Brenda and Erica in the car. Lab results did find that the blood that was on the knife was Brenda's. The FBI then received a tip that somebody had spotted Ron and Dan in Reno, Nevada at the Circus Casino. And when they arrived, they found Ron and Dan. They were standing in a buffet line, and they were able to arrest them with no incident. They were then transported to American Fork Court. They were then arraigned together for aggravated burglary, 2 counts of first-degree murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. Dan had chosen to represent himself with the help of the standby counsel, but he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Ron was given the death sentence because he was seen as the instigator. And back then, they actually gave criminals, people who were sentenced to death, like their choice of how they wanted to be killed. And Ron chose firing squad. And I was wondering why he wanted the firing squad, and it's because he wanted a blood atonement because of his Mormon views. But it is a practice that is not credited by the Mormon church anymore, that supposedly in order for you to be for God to save you for committing a sin, a deadly sin, something like this, that you have to shed blood on the ground in order for that blood to cleanse your sin, something like that. You know, it doesn't make sense. Why would you need a blood atonement for such a terrible sin if God was the one that told you to do these things? Exactly. Chip Carney and Ricky Knapp, they faced the same murder charges. Why can't I talk? They faced the same murder charges, but they did agree to testify for the state and plead guilty, so they reduced their sentence. I'm not sure to what. Before Ron's trial, though, he attempted to commit suicide, which he was unsuccessful. So he was taken to Utah State Hospital, where he spent a few months there recovering. And he actually suffered brain damage and a few other complications. And when he was finally better, they did have his trial, and they tried to appeal the sentence, his conviction, based on his mental status. And because the case was such a high profile case, it supposedly prevented him from getting a fair trial. But he was denied. All of his appeals except one was denied. He was able to receive a retrial in 1996, but he was convicted again on all counts, and he was once again sentenced to death. So now this ties into a different story that I'm working on with a woman. Her name is Christy Streck. Her and her husband began writing to Dan Lafferty while he was in prison, and they became almost obsessed with him. Because she started reading about Dan's case and what he had done. She was 8 years old when this happened, but she fell in love with Dan and his teachings. And I don't want to tell you why yet, because that's coming up in the next story. So I tried looking up what happened to Dan, where he is now, but I couldn't find anything. The only thing there is kind of out there is that he did remarry, but that's literally all that there is on him now. Ron died on November 19th, 2011 from natural causes. Dan is still in prison. He's 72. He's in his late 70s now. Ron was 78 when he died. Dan he spent 34 years in death row, which is one of the longest stays on death row ever at the state prison. Watson Lafferty, which is, Ron and Dan's father, he died in 1983 before these murders took place from diabetes, complications with diabetes. Their mother, Claudine, she died in 2016. She was 96 years old, and she had been affected a lot by what her sons had done. Lorraine Wright, who was Brenda's mother, she died in 2016 at the age of 82. So Ron was supposed to be executed in 2020. Dan, he says that what he did to Brenda and Erica has never bothered him. I feel like he should have gotten the death sentence, to be honest. Brenda's father is still alive. He was actually relieved when he found out that Ron had died, because it saved him like having to go through with watching Ron's execution, which he I don't know, I feel like if you're a normal person, you really don't want to see that, you know. So yeah, like I said, this was kind of a really effed up story. Let me lighten the mood. Let me start by saying any negativity from this like story shall stay within this story. Even for me, like, I do not claim it, I do not send it. Protect yourselves. So soft. So I guess I'll end this video here. It was a heavy one. It was a heavy one to read. It was a heavy one to research. But anyway, this ties into my next video on Christy Streck and her family and how they relate to Dan. Also another effed up story. But yes, if you found this video interesting, even a little bit, if you like plants, if you like breathing, like this video and share it and comment on it. What should I name my tree? Buy some soap. Tell me what you guys want me to make a video about next time. Say what you need, cause you might get it, cause I see you trying, subliminally trying to see if I'm gonna make the video. I admit it would help me if I knew what you wanted. But before I start recording, tell me what to talk about. Tell me what to talk about. Okay. See you next time.